Welcome to another video in the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. Right now we're working on building out our first section of work, which is the basic register. In this video, we're going to be getting information about the logged in user. This will be a complete traversal of the layers. We'll create a store procedure, a model to store the data in the API, an API endpoint, a method that calls the endpoint from our WPF application, and a model to hold data in our WPF application. But before we get started, if you're a Patreon supporter at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure you head over to get their latest source code. Either way, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you can be following along. And finally, as you think of suggestions, please leave them down in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts on this course. I've got a running list of suggestions for improvements, and they're definitely going to make this application better, and that's all thanks to you. So let's get started. Here I have Visual Studio 2019 open. I've transitioned over to 2019 now that I've kind of introduced you to it. I've been using it myself personally for my work for, like I said, a month and a half, 2 months, something like that. And I really like it. And there's not a whole lot of hurdles to get over. In fact, I haven't found any that really trip me up. So we're just going to dive right in and start using it. Now, what we're going to do today is we've got this user interface where we have a login. Where's the view? There's a login view. In this login view, when they log in, if it's successful, we want to gather additional information about them. More specifically, we have this user table. And in the user table, we have first name and last name, email address. Those are pieces of data we want to capture about who's logged in. So we're going to take the information we know, and we're going to call the API and say, give me information about this person. And it's going to call this table, get the information, and send it back to our WPF application. Now to get started, the first thing I think we need is a class library for our API. I don't want to put my code directly in the API because I want some reusability. But just so you know, this class library is for the API, not the API and WPF. Even though they're in the same solution, they're not really the same type of project, and I'm not going to share code between the two of them, or at least not all the code. I may share some code, but for right now, I'm going to create a library that's going to do data access. And so that's going to be separate from my WPF application, which should know nothing about the database, nor have access to it. So let's start shrinking these down because otherwise it's going to be quite large. I'm going to add another project to my solution. So right click on the solution, hit add new project. And I am going to add a class library. And my choices are .NET Standard, .NET Framework, .NET Core, and WCF Service Library. I'm going to choose .NET Framework because that's what we're working with. So we're simulating again this idea that we're using a legacy application or an application that's been built in, before, let's say, this past year or two, because that's what most businesses will have, is they'll have applications that were built in the .NET framework. And so we're simulating that so that we can then transition to .NET Core eventually and see how that works. Because that's one of those big things you're going to have to do in the marketplace is transition over to .NET Core. So learning how to do that is really important. And to do that, you have to have a .NET Framework application first. So .NET Framework it is. Now for naming's going to get hard real quick if we're not careful. We have TRM data, that's our actual database. We have TRM Data Manager, that's our API. And we have TRM Desktop UI, that's our WPF application. So for our class library, let's call it TRM Data Manager.Library. That indicates it's the class library for Data Manager. And we're going to leave it at .NET Framework 4.7.2. And that's the last one I have. I'm going to hit Create. So now I have a new class library. The first thing I do is delete class 1. So let's clear out the currently open items. And now let's start creating the files we know we need in here. So let's right click and say add class. And this class is going to be the data access class for our library. So let's call it SQL Data Access. Make it public. And in here, we're going to create a read method and a write method and a method to get the connection string. Let's start with the easy one. Let's get the connection string. So public string, let's call it get connection string, and give it the name of the connection string. So you're going to pass in the connection string name and get back a value. If we open up our web config, we see we have a connection string called default connection, and this is the connection string it returns. So let's say return configuration manager, hit control dot here. We can add the reference to system.configuration.dll. Now, if you don't have this option here, first of all, check to make sure you've spelled it right and the casing is correct. But if you still don't have this option, I'll show you how to add the library manually. But for now, let's select add reference. Notice it's also going to add the using system.configuration. So there's using system.configuration. And also we have the reference now to system.configuration. If you want to add it manually, right click on references, say add reference. In assemblies, search for system.configuration, check the box, and then hit OK. So we have configuration manager dot connection strings, pass in the name of our connection string, and return back the connection string. So this goes out to the web config or app.config, gets the connection string with a matching name, and returns that connection string. That's all this method does. Now, in case you're not familiar, this library does not have a web config or a app.config. That's because it's a library, not a front-end application. This DLL cannot run on its own. It has to run through an executable or through a website, which means that it doesn't have to have a configuration file because it's going to depend on the configuration file of whoever's running it. In this case, we're going to run it through the TRM Data Manager, our API. So it's going to grab the web config settings from that web config, the one from our API. All right, next, we're going to need to add a couple of methods for getting and setting data. And to do that, we're also going to need to have Dapper installed. So in our library, right-click on References, say Manage NuGet Packages, go to Browse, and search for Dapper. 16.2 million downloads. The latest current stable version is 1.60.1. So select that and install it. Hit OK to the changes. Close out of the library. And now we have Dapper installed. So now I can start using Dapper. In case you're not familiar, Dapper is a kind of like a micro ORM. An ORM is an object relational mapper. Essentially what it does is it allows us to talk to our database, get the information back, and map that data into objects. It's very fast. It's efficient. It works really well with stored procedures. It does not generate code, which is one of the things that displeases me about Entity Framework, is it generates code, which you have to maintain. Whereas this, it's all kind of for you to see, and you do it all. Therefore, you know it all. So let's create a read method. So we're going to say public. It's going to return back a list of T. We're going to use generics here. Let's say load data. I'm going to take in a T and a U. And we're going to say that you're going to pass in the stored procedure. That's the name of the stored procedure you want to call. And then we're going to pass in U, which is our parameters. And the string, which is our connection string name. So these three pieces of information will allow us to load data from the database. So we'll start off with a using statement and say using I, capital D, lowercase b, connection, hit control dot to add our using statement for system.data. And we'll say CNN. It's just a short little name. Yes, we could call it connection, but then we have this whole long thing every time. So we call it CNN equals new SQL connection. Control dot to add our using system.data.SQL client. And we pass in a connection string, which we don't have yet. So let's get that. String connection string equals get connection string for connection string name. Now we can pass that connection string into our SQL connection. Oh, look at that. It actually auto-completed for me to connection. Yeah, I'm not gonna go crazy over that. So let's leave it as it is. It's not the end of the world. Either way. So we need to have a load in here to actually get our data. So a loading method, which would be a query. So let's break it apart into two different sections. So we'll just say list of T rows equals connection dot query. This is where Dapper comes in. So control dot using Dapper. We're going to say it's of type T. Pass in the stored procedure. Pass in our parameters. And set the command to be command type to be command type dot stored procedure. I'll break this apart in a couple rows here so you can actually see it. Because we still have to do dot to list. So let's break this apart let's break it apart right here. There you go. So what this does is it makes a connection to our database, or takes a connection to our database, which is right here. It has a query. It says, this is the type of model that I want each row to be. Passes in the store procedure name and the parameters, which that's type U, which that's a generic. Meaning I could have called it anything. I could call it any letter, but I'm calling it type U, and those are the parameters. And finally, we've used the connection string here to get the full connection string, the connection string name to get the full connection string. So it calls a store procedure, passes in the parameters, and says, hey, by the way, this is a store procedure, and it's going to return back a set of rows, which we then just return. Return rows, and you're done. So that is our load data method. It's generic and it allows us to not have to worry about all the inner workings of how Dapper works or any of that kind of stuff. We have one load data method that will probably do for about 98% of everything we need to do. There are certain cases where this won't be ideal. For example, these parameters, if we want to have output parameters, we have to use the dynamic parameters type, which comes from Dapper, which means that any caller has to know about Dapper. This will still work with this if the caller knows about Dapper, but not every caller will, and so we'll have to maybe adjust some things. But that's down the road. For right now, this will work great. Now we need one more method, just so we have it. We're not going to use it quite yet, but we're going to have it, and that is save data. And for right now, we're going to return void. We may return something else in the future, but for right now, I think that's fine. So what we need to do is just pass in one type here. We have a store procedure, and we're going to say T is parameters. Now, this is kind of a debate. We were passing in a U here for parameters, but down here it's a T for parameters. I get that, but I think I still want to keep it as T, and the reason why is because in generics, the common thing is of type T. T is like the number one, the first choice for your generic letter. And after that, we usually go T, U, V, W, and so on. So I think I want to keep it at T and not confuse people and say, well, it's of type U instead of T. And they go, why is it U and not T? So this way it makes a little more sense, I think, and it's a little more consistent. So we have save data here. So we're not going to be loading rows or returning rows or doing toList. Instead, we're not going to pass in the of type T. Instead, we're going to do execute and pass in our store procedure, our parameters, and our command type. Now, one thing that brought up that we haven't done yet, but we probably will in the future at some point, is we can do this asynchronously. And right now we're not. So that's something that we'll get into fairly soon, because we want to transition this over to an asynchronous process just to kind of save ourselves some time and make the UI a little more responsive. Now, if these are a little more advanced than you're used to as far as methods, there's a couple things to know. First of all, yes, these are a little more advanced. It uses generics and it uses Dapper, and it's really condensed down to just what we need, and it's pretty dense in a lot of ways. So if it confuses you, don't worry. You're not dumb for sure. It's just that it's using some advanced stuff. But I've got videos on this, so if you go and watch the generics video, that will help. Also, if you watch my either connecting C# to SQL video, which is talking about starting with Dapper, or then also my follow-up advanced Dapper video, those videos will help you on the Dapper side. So the generics on the generic side, and the Dapper side is connecting C# to SQL, and also the advanced Dapper video, those two videos. So with those, I think that you'll understand more of what's going on if you don't already. All right, next up, I want to create a class in the library. And this class is going to be how we get the data. So I don't want my user interface to know about store procedures. I don't want to know anything about how the actual implementation works. I just want the user interface to know, which that's the API, by the way. The API is the user interface. I just want it to know that it wants data, it asks for data. So that's what this class is going to do. It's going to kind of abstract away how it gets done and just say, okay, you want data, here's the data you're going to get. Now, I think I'm going to call this user data. And I'm actually going to put it into public first. Don't forget that. I'm going to put it into a folder. So let's create a folder inside our library called Data Access. And then inside that folder, I am going to move the user data. So yes, I'm going to hit OK to that. And now it's in the user data, or in the data access folder. However, it didn't change the namespace, so I'm going to change that for us manually. Data access. That way it matches up for all new ones we create in the data access folder. I haven't put the SQL data access into the data access folder because I wonder if I want that in a little different spot. And I think the answer is yes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder. And again, naming is hard, but I think what I'll do is I will call this internal. It may sound like a weird name, but let me show you why I'm going to do this. Once I create the next folder, which is data access, I'm going to move SQL data access to internal.dataaccess, which again, I'll have to modify the namespace to be .internal.dataaccess to match where it is right now. But the reason I do this is because this class, instead of being public, I'm going to make it internal. Not interface, internal. What that means is this can't be seen or used by anything outside the library. And that's what I want. Because I don't want anything outside the library to directly be talking to the database. I want it to go through this data access layer instead. So that's why I'm making it internal. That's why I'm putting it in the internal folder, and it separates it out. So I know anything in internal, first of all, it is internal only for internal use. And then from there, I know these are the tools that I use as kind of helper methods or things that I can do internally to give to the methods that actually talk externally. So here, let's create our first, well, we need to create a models folder too. Models, and that's good. So user data access, what it's going to do is we're going to get information about user data. You're going to get information about the user table. In this case, we're going to have a store procedure that just gets the first name, last name, and email address based upon the user's ID. Let's actually create that store procedure. So add store procedure. We're going to call this SP user lookup. We're going to pass in one item. So that's going to be the ID. And that is going to be, let's look at the type here, nvarchar 128. We're not going to give a default. And then we're going to do a select star from, well, we'll start with select star, we'll expand it. Select star, if I can type here, from dbo.user, love that autocomplete. dbo.user, where, and see, nothing about the DBO. We will look at that in just a minute. Where the ID equals @ID. Now, why is it yelling at us about the user database or user table? Incorrect syntax near user. Interesting. Well, we're going to try a couple things, but I think maybe it's a bug, not positive. Let's put it in brackets just in case. Because you are suggesting it to me, so therefore it should work. And it does work now with brackets. Interesting. I don't like that, but it is what it is. I'm going to control dot here on my star and not get anything, which is awesome. So Control J brings up a list and it gives me every possible option, which is also not cool. So first name, last name, and email address. I'm thinking this is a quirk either with 2019 or maybe it's just I have to close out and start back up again. So I'm not sure. I also don't have my begin statement and my end. And let's set the no count on. Like so. So there we go. We got our store procedure finally created. Again, a little messier than I wanted it to be. In 2017, I could have hit Control Dot and filled that in. And I don't think it would have yelled at me for not having the square brackets around DBO and user. It may be because user is a reserved name. That's an outside possibility. So either way, we have our store procedure. It's called SP user lookup. Just copy that. So now in our user data, we're going to create a public list of, let's create a list of user model, which you don't have yet. That's okay. And it's going to be called get user by ID, string ID. So this will get a list of user model from the database by the ID. So what we need to do here in order to get this to work? Well, we need a model. Right click on models, add class user model. Make it public. And we want it to be a string ID. I know it's hard that an ID is a string in this case, but it is what it is. String first name, string last name, string email address. And there was a created date. Let's include that. Now our store procedure should probably return the ID as well. And it doesn't hurt to return created date as well. Just we don't have empty columns. We could. It's not the end of the world, but we're not going to. Okay, Control Dot on that now to add the using statement for the correct location. And now what we'll do is we will take our SQL Data Access class. So let's create a new instance of that. Now, if you follow along with any dependency injection stuff that I've done, you just cringed because you don't like the idea of bringing in a dependency with that new. And that's a good thing. We're going to add dependency injections very, very soon. We'll add autofac in here and take away our dependency, our direct dependencies, and work against interfaces instead. For this video, we're not going to. We're just going to do the direct dependency. So SQL data access and call it SQL equals new SQL data access like so. We'll hit control dot here to add the using statement. And now we can say SQL dot load data. And we need to pass in a stored procedure name, which there's our stored procedure name. Actually, we'll go ahead and put DBO in front of it. And then we need to pass in parameters. Well, we haven't set the parameter list yet, so let's just say P for now. And the connection string, again, we're going to set this up in the future, but for right now, we're going to hard code this to say that we're going to look for, and it's not as bad as it sounds, but it's still not ideal. We're going to look for our default connection because that's what's going to connect to our TRM data manager. Whoops. That's going to connect our TRM data manager database, which right now is named horribly. We're going to rename that as one of the suggestions from one of the users, and I like it. I really think we should rename that. So we're going to do that at a future point, but for right now, we're not going to cover that yet. Okay, so that's our load data, which is going to return back a list of T, which, what is that list of T? Well, we want to have it return back a list of user model. And it says, hey, you know what? You have 2 arguments here, not 1. Now, this is a bit tricky just because we have to specify T because user model isn't used anywhere in here. So therefore we have to specify it. But for you, I kind of didn't want to have a concrete object. I kind of wanted to use a anonymous class. The problem is anonymous classes don't have a concrete type that I can pass in. And I can't say, well, just specify user model because you saw it doesn't allow that. We're going to try dynamic since we're in the same assembly. It won't work across assemblies, but it might work here. So we're going to find out real quick. So what is that anonymous object? Well, I'm going to say var p equals new. Let's open the right curly braces here. And we need to pass in ID equals ID. Which looks weird, I know. But what this does is we're passing in this string right here and saying the property name is ID. Now, since the property name is the name of the object we're passing in, we could just have just ID, but like that. But I like to have it specified because if not all of them are that way, it gets a little confusing mixing and matching. So this way it's just explicit. So this is an anonymous object. It's an object with no named type. We're going to pass it in and call it dynamic, which again, I think will work inside the same assembly, meaning inside of this DLL, but not necessarily across assemblies. And that's, I think, okay, but we're going to see. So now this is going to load our data. I'm going to say var output equals. I don't have to do this. I could just return this right here, this whole list. I'm not going to do that because I want to put it into a variable first that I can inspect and make sure it's correct. The other thing to note here is that all of this would really benefit with some unit testing. I don't have unit testing set up yet, but that's coming to this project. So we're going to make sure that we add that in. We're not doing test-driven development, which would be doing the unit test first and then writing the code. But we're going to bring unit tests in and kind of upgrade our system. Because again, usually when you come into a real world environment, a lot of the time, I'm not going to say all the time, I'm not going to say most of the time, but a lot of the time, you're going to find a code base that has little or no unit tests. So we're going to simulate that. Not too far. We're not going to go too far down the rabbit hole. But then we'll bring in unit tests and see how to start adding them back in after the fact, where they make the most good and where your management can see just how valuable they are. So we're going to be strategic about how you put them in order to show off their usefulness right away. So that's down the road. But for right now, we have our getUserById method, and it's public, and it's in the public class user data. So now we can collapse this, and inside of our controller, we have an account controller. We don't have a user controller yet. So let's create one. We're going to create an empty MVC. Let's create one with read and write actions, just so we have it scaffolded out for us. We're going to call this the user controller. Now, on this class, just like with the account class, notice we have the authorize over the entire class. We're going to go ahead and do that and set the route prefix up just so that we're ready. The route prefix will be the same as what it would be inferred as, but this is a little more specific. We're just making sure everyone knows it's going to be API/user. So we have the index, we have details, we have create, and all the rest. But we're actually going to wipe out all of these for right now, except for the details one. We're going to call this getById. And it's going to string. And we're going to get rid of this comment because it's actually not correct. And now instead of just returning view, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new connection down to our library and call user data. So we want to say user data, which control dot, I don't know. Hey, it will. Look at that. It allows us now with user data to say, you know what? I think you actually want to add a reference to your trmdatamanager.library and then add that using statement for data access. Sure, I do. We'll call this data equals new user data. Again, this is a dependency. I'm going to want to disconnect this. Data dot get by user ID, pass in our ID, and we get back a list of model. And you know what? I created an MVC controller here, not an API controller, and that's a bummer. I want an API controller, which here's how you change that. Instead of inheriting from controller, inherit from API controller. Now, what we're going to look for right here is, I'm actually going to grab one of these as, not one of these. Let's grab a different one from the home controller. Nope, values controller. Much better. Which the value controller is pretty simple. So I like to have an example to work off of instead of working from nothing. So I'm going to paste this in and just look at it for example, which there's nothing to this. I have public string get. Well, I'm going to, instead of action result, I can return a string, or actually a list of user model. And I think I'll do that. List of user model. Control dot on that. Now, you may be wondering, let's delete our example now. You may be wondering why I would do a model that's down in my library and not in my models folder here. And that's a great question. So right now, what I'm doing, I'll add the using statement there too. What I'm doing here is I am saying that I don't really care about modifying that model, the model that came from the library. That's a data access model, which is a different model than the model in my API. The API model is for display models. The difference is display models, you might modify the names in order to be less techy and more user-friendly. You might apply certain attributes. For example, you might even override the name in further and say, well, it's first name, all one word, but we actually, when we display it, we want to say first space name. So there's a lot of different things you can do in a display model. So what happens if you want a display model, but you're getting a data access model back? Well, that's where you use a tool like AutoMapper to map between the two models. You actually want to create a new model out of the data from the old model. So a display model gets created from the data of a data access model. And that may seem like extra work and all the rest, but the reality is that's what you need to do in order to have true separation of concerns. You don't want to put display information on a model down in your library, because that ties the user interface then to your library, or ties a library to your user interface. So make sure you keep those separations. All right, so I think I messed some stuff up here. I had to take MVC out. There we go. So now the values controller didn't have that route prefix, so we'll keep with that same format. And we do have the authorize above. And I think that's it. So I think we're all set to call this. The one thing I don't want to do actually, though, is I don't want to do that. And that may seem counterintuitive because I need that ID, but I don't want to ask the user for that ID. I want to get that from who is logged in. And to do that, what we'll do is we're going to grab the HTTP context dot current context dot user identity get. We don't have a get user ID, huh? So the identity, we then need to get the information about that user. And you know what? I actually did it over here in the values controller, I think. Yep. There we go. So it's actually request context. Okay. Got it wrong. Wrong one. There we go. So get user ID, hit control dot to add the Microsoft.ASP.NET.identity using statement. There's a lot of using statements here, but it's okay. So now I have the user ID from who is logged in. You see the difference there? If I allowed them to pass in the user ID, they could look up anyone they wanted to. But because I said, no, you only get to see the user of who is logged in by doing it this way, then they can't just guess at user IDs and get back information. So maybe I'm logged in as, I don't know, the janitor. But if I kept guessing at user IDs, maybe I could find the CEO's information. Well, first of all, it'd be really hard because GUIDs are hard to guess. But even so, I don't want to allow that security hole. So I'm going to get the information about who's logged in and use that user ID as the key to look up the user. This is why our users table doesn't have an integer for the ID. It has the actual GUID, because we're going to know that on every single call we make. Therefore, we'll use that to limit what the user can see based upon who they are. Okay, so now we have this get by ID method, and that's in the user controller. Now what we need to do is on the other side, we need to make this call. But first, let's go ahead and start our API and see if we can't make this call directly and see if it works. Also, we're going to need to add some data to our database. So let's first of all come to our data and we're going to deploy. So let's publish. Double click on the publish. Wait for it to come up. Hit publish. That publishes locally. And that's going to publish our store procedure so it's there. So we're done. Now you can go to our SQL Server Object Explorer. There we go. SQL Server. I believe it's in this one. And there's our TRM Data Manager with that ugly name. And in the users table, oops, wait, that's the other one. We'll get to that one. We have our ASP.users, but then is it down here? Yes, TRM data user. No. There it is. Okay. I have too many dummy databases flying around. But in our user table, we don't have any records. In fact, if we were to view the data here, it's null. So let's manually populate one, just one. And that will be my username. So ASP.users, let's view the data. And we have tim@timcorey.com as a login. There's the ID. Let's copy that. Then come back over to users. We're going to paste in that ID. And now I'm going to say Tim Corey, spell it right, and tim@timcorey.com. And create a date we can leave alone because that's going to auto-generate the date time for us, like so. And now we're done. So now we have a record in here. So now if we start this, we'll be able to use our Swagger to run that one command and just make sure it's working. So once this loads, we'll go to our Swagger. And in Swagger, we have our account, which has a whole bunch of things. We have our user, which now has our API/user. And we have auth, which we want to call our token. So tim@imtimcorey.com and pwd12345 dot. And yeah, it displays it. Woohoo. And now we have our token, which I can copy this. Another one of those fixes that a user suggested is how we can use that token up here and then not have to put it in everywhere. We're going to look into that in a future video as well. But in our user section, it's going to return back an ID, a first name, a last name, an email address, and a date created. Let's authorize and try it out. And authorization has been denied for this request. Interesting. I wonder why. Let's make sure the token is correct by running a different command. So let's go to our values and just look up a value. Hit try it out. And authorization has been denied. So it looks like our token we didn't copy correctly. Let's copy it. Now let's come up here to our values. Control A and delete it. Paste it in. Try it out. And we're still getting authorization has been denied. Interesting. I wonder why. This is where you kind of get stuck sometimes where we want to debug something. We could try putting a breakpoint in our values control, but I don't think it'll even get here because it's not been authorized. So just putting a breakpoint there, I don't think it's going to help us because let's just demonstrate that. I'll put a breakpoint right there at the beginning, but even calling that get command, it doesn't hit it because it's not even getting that far. Let's look at our login down here and make sure that, in fact, it's not expired. It's not. It is a correct bearer token. So for some reason, it's not accepting this as a valid token. So something has broken our system and we don't know what it is. Now, there's a couple things we can do. First of all, we can poke around and try and figure out what's changed since it was working. I think that's probably the best place to start. So let's look at, we can go to Team Explorer, go to Changes, and look at all the things that have changed. Now, it's not in the data project, and it's not going to be in the library project. It'll be in the data manager project, because that's the thing that has really changed. We've changed the CS proj and we've changed the user controller. So if we double click on the file, it's going to bring up the file itself, but that's not really helpful because that's a new file. But if we double click on the CS proj, there we go. It brings up a side by side. This might not be something you're used to, but what this is what's called a diff. And so it's find the differences between the file that we on the right that is the new file, the file that exists now, and the file on the left is the file at what's called head, which is the last commit on the current branch we're on. So you can see the differences, and notice on the right in the gutter, it shows there's a few different areas where there's changes. So there's a change right here for where we add the user controller.cs. Scroll down a little further. There is an include views/user in the item group. And then down here, there is include for TRM data manager. All of those look correct, and they don't look like they cause a problem for us. So I don't think that's the issue. Now, it could be the issue came into play a couple of versions ago because the login is working correctly. So since the login is working correctly, we don't know necessarily that the rest was working correctly because we weren't trying it. So you might have to go a couple versions back and see what changed. Now, I do have one thing I want to think about, and that is maybe we had a NuGet update where we updated something and broke something. Now, the Owen version is 2.2. That's the latest. And then if we keep looking down here, I believe there's one for JWT. I'm not positive. Nope, not for this package. That's okay. So let's look. We have Owen. We have identity.core, which is not .NET Core. It's Core Identity, which is confusing. And we have Owen. These are all latest versions. In fact, the updates, we only have one, and it's on Bootstrap. But I'm wondering if maybe we updated this after we tried different things, and maybe one of these things caused an issue. How do we know which one it is, and how do we fix it? Well, one area we can look in is we can go to Google, because Google has a lot of answers. Now, don't just blindly copy and paste, but at the same time, the reason why Stack Overflow is so huge is because a lot of developers run into weird problems and they ask the question, somebody else answers it because they found the answer to that weird problem, and everyone benefits. So if you Google the actual name of the error and ASP.NET MVC along with that in the Google search, you'll come across a few different options. One of them says, hey, you know what? Make sure that you have changed your registration order, or the registration order is correct, which it should be because it was. But it says look for the app builder, which that should be, I believe, in startup, but we're going to find out. There we go. So that's in startup.auth. And it says make sure that you use your Use Web API. Use Web API is, and it's not even there. Interesting. It made sure it's in the right order, which we don't have it set up here. I don't think that applies to us. So that's probably not our issue. And I think I found my solution. This is where, not having done this a little bit, I forgot something and Stack Overflow pointed it out to me. So let's go /swagger, and you're probably yelling at the screen by now. That's good. If you caught my mistake, cool. I appreciate it. Yell louder next time. Let me log in again and show what I forgot. So I log in, and I'm going to grab my token. I'm going to copy my token, go up to values. We know this works. Before I paste it in, I'm going to type bearer, then space. Let's try it out. There's my values. So I had to put bearer first before my token. So it's authorization, bearer, and then the token. That's the thing I forgot. Now we can go to user and call this and type bearer, space, our token, try it out, wait for it to run, and see what happens. Now this is the first time we're talking to a database, and I don't think we put a breakpoint in, but it's acting like we did, so we'll see. And yeah, sure enough, there's a breakpoint here. So let's find out where our breakpoint is. Right there. It's not a breakpoint, it's an exception. Could not find store procedure dbo.spuser lookup. Interesting. It couldn't find our store procedure. Let's find out why not. My guess is that our database is called TRM data, but in our connection string, should go here. Our connection string, we just have the default connection, and that's it. So let's go ahead and add a new connection. So let's go to end and add a new one. And call us TRM data. And say that the connection string equals, I'm actually going to copy and paste this one right here. Oh, I believe I can get as well from our publish. Yep, right there. Just copy that. Paste it in here. And now we need to make sure that we call this using the correct name. Instead of default connection is TRM data. So let's go to our library, user data, and TRM data. Let's run this again. This is one of those times when those little details kind of trip you up, and if you just keep poking at it, you'll get there. Because everything's about details in programming. It just is. So the more you get used to the idea that you're going to make little detail mistakes, the better off you'll be. Auth, token, username. I should have saved my token. That's okay. I can get a new one pretty quickly. User, get user, bearer, try it out, and it says could not find store procedure. Interesting. Still can't find it. So our connection string is local DB, MS local DB, integrated security. So that's just the database, not the data source, not the actual database itself. I was moving too quick on that one. So when I say publish location, it's a target database, not the actual database name. So let's come back down here to our connection string in our web.config. And here we have our attached DB file name right here. And initial catalog. We don't have these things in our other one, so let's copy this. And let's overwrite everything after our data source. But instead of this, it's called TRM data. And the catalog should be the same. Like so. And I copy and paste it again, overwrote my clipboard. I wonder if my clipboard ring has it does not. That's a bummer. So, Swagger, auth, token, Tim at IamTimCorey.com, super secret password, try it out, get my token, copy it, user API, bearer, the token, try it out. Looks like we're back at the breakpoint. Cannot attach file as database. All right, I'm going to paste that bearer token before I forget about it. I have now pasted it, so I know that I can get back into it more quickly. Let's find out what the actual connection string is. I should have done this in the first place. TRM data. If you come down here to properties, one of the things in here is connection string. Forgot about that. It happens. Paste it in. Let's look at it real quick before you just go rushing off and do it. According to this, it doesn't have anything in here. It just has timeout and all the rest. That's not correct. So let's go back to that database. Go back to the properties. And let's find out why it didn't copy that whole thing. Let's copy it again and paste it in. And now we have data source, local DB, initial catalog, TRM data, integrated security is true, timeout 60, encrypt is false, trust certificate is true, application intent is for read-write, and multi-subnet failover is false. So it looks like we're set now our connection string. Would you know how to type that out? Probably not. I don't. I just rely on, I rely on copy and paste. That way it doesn't, I don't mess it up, which I can still mess it up with the copy and a paste. But at least it's easier for me. If you need to build a connection string, go to connectionstrings.com and they have connection strings for you for all the different types and examples so that you can just take the example and modify it for your needs. User, get user, bearer, there's that token. Try it out. Ooh, we've got a response. Isn't that awesome? The response is an array of one user, which we can change that to be just one user since that's all it's going to be. And now it is an ID, which that's my GUID, my first name, my last name, and my email address along with when that was created. Excellent. So now this is working as intended. That's why you test early and often, because you make stupid mistakes or otherwise cause things to break, you have issues. All right, so we're going to call that part 1 because I don't want to make this a 2-hour video. I want to give you time to kind of absorb all the things we've done, including kind of my debugging session as I went. If you haven't caught on by now, I've started to debug almost every video because that's real life. The reality is, even if you've done this 100 times, things change over time or you miss a simple thing. I did that a couple times tonight, but the end result is that you have to learn to debug. And if you get frustrated, if you give up, if you wipe your code out and start over, these are not good traits for long-term developers. You have to be able to embrace the fact that you made mistakes. You have to embrace the fact that your first solution didn't work, and the fact that maybe there's layers to your error, not just one error. So it's okay. Problems happen, mistakes happen, code breaks. It's not the end of the world. The keys are, first of all, try and test early and often. Now, I couldn't test too much when I was building my table or my store procedure. If I had had unit testing in place, I could have, which would have been awesome. I should have done that, and we're going to do that in the future so we don't have to wait until an API is published before we ready to test, or before we test out our functionality. But I didn't have that luxury. And so I then went and created the endpoint, and only then, after I wrote a number of bits of code, was I able to test to make sure it worked, and it didn't. So I had to solve a few different issues, and it's okay. But it would have been much better if I could have tested earlier. That's where unit tests really shine, because you can test almost immediately, or in the case, if you're doing a test-driven development, you can test before you're even writing code, which sounds silly, but the reality is it's important, because if you test first and the test fails, when you write code to make it pass, you know the reason it passed is because the code made it pass, not because you wrote a bad test that always passes. So that's kind of a side note. So that's point 1, the fact that bugs are going to happen and you have to test early and test often to make sure that you catch those bugs when you know what the change was that caused the bug. Next is don't give up. Just keep plugging away at it. Don't just say, oh, I need help from somebody else. Oh, I need to post this somewhere. I need to ask on Stack Overflow. Don't go there yet. Give it time. Just keep picking away at it. You can go to Stack Overflow, but to read, not to ask for help. Because if the first thing you do is go to ask for help, more likely than not, people will realize that in how you ask. And that frustrates people because it's not the internet's job to do your job. So you have to show that you've put in the effort towards it, because everyone gets stuck. It's okay. But if you're getting stuck is because you didn't try anything, that's not okay. So try it, poke at it, try different things. In this case, one of the things I didn't do, but that I could have done, and let me demonstrate that just so that you're kind of aware of what I can do. Let's go ahead and open the file in Explorer. And I'm going to actually do a git bash here. And git bash, what it allows me to do is this is git, G-I-T, source control on top of a bash window. So I can say git status. And this gives me all the changes that are currently not staged and untracked. One of the things I can do is I can do a git stash. Now what that did if we look at get status again, I have untracked files, but I don't have any changes to my actual project. If we could now go look at my project, let's close everything because it says it wasn't even there. And let's refresh our list here. So let's hit the refresh button. And now look at, well, first of all, the user controller. That's there because it's a new file. This is here because it's a new file. Those new files are there, but all of our changes aren't there. So if I were to run this, none of the changes I've done are there. But now I can just say get stash pop and bring those changes back. And now all of a sudden, all the changes to my projects, to my solution, they're all there because they brought them back with the get stash pop. What that allows me to do is say, you know what? Maybe I need to start from the beginning and try again to figure out if this works at the beginning or if I had to keep rolling back. But that's another way you can try and test out, did my change make this problem or was it a previous change and my change had nothing to do with the actual problem? So lots of ways you can go about this, but the key is to just keep poking at it until you figure something out. Sometimes, if you're late, if it's tired, you can see I'm tired. If it's late and if you're tired, then maybe walk away, go to sleep, take a shower, go for a run, do something that has nothing to do with programming. Come back, it'll look different. Trust me. Okay? So those are the things that they're going to keep popping up because this is real life. And real life is not a clean and neat, compact tutorial. It's messy. You create bugs and things don't work the way you expect them to. Don't panic. Don't worry. It happens to everybody. The key is, how do you deal with it? Okay? Sorry, a little bit of soapbox, but I'll make sure that you really feel comfortable with the idea that you're not perfect and it's okay. All right. Thanks for watching. We're in part 2, which will be next week. We'll come back and hit the other half of this where we take this API endpoint data and we'll bring it into our WPF project, which also means a class library on that side. And we're going to store it long term while the user's logged in. That way, on any page, we can say, this is the user. So we can say, hey, hello, Tim, or things of that nature. Okay? So with that, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.